Some men spend their whole lives searching for home, only to realize it was never a place at all. Silas Ray had lost more than his wife when she passed. He'd lost his reason to stay anywhere. For years, he wandered dusty back roads with nothing but his old donkey, Maple, and the weight of memories he couldn't shake. When he bought a forgotten cabin in the woods for pocket change, he expected 4 walls and shelter, nothing more. But buried beneath decades of dust and neglect, he found something that would change everything. A box of letters, photographs, and journals connecting him to a past he never knew existed. What dark secret was hidden in that ruined cabin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck rattled over the washboard road, kicking up dust that hung in the autumn air like smoke. Silas Ray kept both hands on the wheel, his weathered fingers wrapped around cracked leather that had molded to his grip over 30 years of use. In the rear-view mirror, he could see Maple's long ears bobbing in the trailer, her patience with travel as steady as it had always been. He was 73 years old, though most days he felt older. The lines on his face told stories of sun and wind, of seasons spent working cattle and mending fences, of laughter that had once come easy and tears that had come harder. His wife Emma had been gone 5 years now, and in that time Silas had learned that grief wasn't something that faded. It just changed shape, became something you carried different. The cabin came into view through a break in the pines. It sat in a small clearing, its roof sagging like an old horse's back, its windows dark and empty as the eyes of a skull. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper with character, which Silas understood to mean it was barely standing and nobody else wanted it. He'd paid $4,000 for it, money he'd saved from selling off his last herd of cattle and the small ranch he and Emma had built together. That ranch had been their life's work. Every fence post a memory, every pasture a chapter in their shared story. But after Emma died, Silas found he couldn't stay there. The silence was too loud. Every corner reminded him of her. The kitchen, where she'd hummed while making biscuits, the porch where they'd watched sunsets, the bedroom where he'd held her hand during those last difficult weeks. He'd sold it to a young couple with 3 children, and though the money had been fair, watching them move in had felt like giving away pieces of his own heart. For 2 years after that, he drifted. He bought a truck camper and drove from town to town, picking up odd jobs when he needed cash. Maple traveled with him, content to graze wherever they stopped. The donkey had been Emma's idea, bought on a whim from a livestock auction 20 years back. Emma had named her Maple because of the reddish-brown color of her coat, like autumn leaves. After Emma passed, Maple became more than a pet. She became a witness to his grief, a warm presence that asked nothing of him but care and company. Silas parked the truck and sat for a moment, studying the cabin through the dusty windshield. The place looked worse up close. The porch steps had rotted through in places, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges. Vines had crawled up the side of the structure, their leaves brown and brittle with the season. But the bones of it seemed solid enough, log construction, probably 80 or 90 years old, with a stone chimney that still stood straight. He climbed out of the truck, his knees protesting the movement. Age had a way of making itself known in the joints first, he'd found. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, clean and sharp after the dusty roads. He could hear a creek somewhere nearby, its water running over stones, with a sound like quiet conversation. Maple nickered from the trailer, impatient to be free. Silas walked back and opened the gate, and she stepped down carefully, her hooves finding purchase on the uneven ground. She was getting old too, grey around her muzzle now, moving with the same careful deliberation that Silas recognized in himself. They were a pair of old wanderers, he thought, both past their prime, but not quite ready to quit. He tied Maple's lead to a sturdy pine and fetched her some hay from the truck. She began eating with calm efficiency while he turned his attention to the cabin. The front door resisted at first, swollen with moisture, but a good shove with his shoulder sent it scraping inward. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that sent a crow flapping from a nearby tree. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. Silas stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged from the gloom. A single large room made up most of the space, with a smaller room, probably a bedroom, visible through an open doorway in the back. The floor was wooden planks, warped and stained but mostly intact. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with old ashes and bird nests. But it was the sheer amount of junk that surprised him. The previous owner, or owners, had left everything behind. Furniture sat draped in dusty sheets like sleeping ghosts. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their cardboard soft with age and damp. Mason jars lined makeshift shelves, their contents unidentifiable. Newspapers yellowed on a small table. A rusted wood stove sat in one corner, its pipe disconnected and lying across the floor. Silas walked further in, his boots leaving prints in the thick dust. The place had been abandoned for years, that much was clear. He pulled back one of the sheets and found an old armchair, its upholstery eaten through by mice. Another sheet revealed a dining table with 3 chairs, solid oak beneath the grime. He spent the next hour opening windows, those that would open, and propping the door wide to let fresh air circulate. The place needed more than airing out. It needed a complete overhaul. But standing there in that dusty, cluttered space, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. This was a project. This was something to do with his hands, something to fill the empty days. By the time the sun began sinking toward the tree line, he'd set up his camp. He strung a temporary corral for Maple using rope and trees, giving her room to graze and move. He laid out his sleeping bag in the back of his truck, rather than attempt the cabin's uncertain floor on the first night. He built a small fire in a ring of stones and heated a can of beans, eating them straight from the pot while the forest settled into its evening sounds. That night, lying in his sleeping bag and looking up at stars visible through the truck's open topper, Silas thought about Emma. She would have loved this place, would have seen past the ruin to what it could become. She'd always had that gift, seeing the potential in broken things. She'd certainly seen something in him when they'd met, a broke cowboy with more debts than prospects. They'd built their life together from nothing, and it had been good. More than good, it had been rich with meaning and shared work. He missed her in ways that went beyond words. Missed her voice. Missed the way she'd touch his arm when she wanted his attention. Missed how she made coffee too strong and biscuits too light, and how she'd hum old hymns while washing dishes. The missing had carved out a hollow place in him that nothing seemed to fill. But maybe, he thought as sleep began to find him, maybe he wasn't meant to fill it. Maybe he was just meant to keep going, to find new ways to carry what he'd lost, while still making something of the days he had left. Morning came cold and bright. Silas woke to the sound of Maple's hooves moving through fallen leaves and the distant call of a hawk. He made coffee on his camp stove, strong and black the way Emma had taught him to like it, and ate leftover biscuits he'd bought 3 days ago in the last town. With daylight filling the clearing, the cabin looked both better and worse. Better because he could see the solid construction beneath the neglect. Worse because the full extent of the damage was now visible: missing shingles on the roof, rotted windowsills, gaps in the chinking between logs. He decided to start with the inside, sorting through the decades of accumulated belongings. It would tell him something about who had lived here, and it would clear space for him to work on the structure itself. The first box he opened contained old magazines from the 1970s, their pages brittle and foxed. He set them aside for burning. The next held kitchen items: mismatched plates, bent utensils, a cast-iron skillet thick with rust. The skillet was salvageable. He'd clean it up. Box after box revealed the mundane archaeology of abandoned lives. Clothes too moth-eaten to save. Tools too rusted to use. Books swollen with moisture, their pages stuck together. He worked steadily through the morning, sorting items into piles: keep, burn, figure out later. It was in the bedroom, in the back of a closet beneath a pile of old quilts, that he found the wooden chest. It was about 2 feet long and a foot deep, made of cedar that had weathered the years better than most things in the cabin. The wood still held a faint, spicy scent. Brass hinges, green with age, held the lid in place. A small brass latch, surprisingly intact, kept it closed. Silas lifted the chest and carried it to the main room, where light streamed through the open windows. He set it on the old dining table, wiping away a layer of dust with his hand. For a moment he hesitated. This chest, hidden away and latched shut, held someone's private things. Opening it felt like trespassing on memory, but curiosity won, as it always does. He worked the latch free. It moved easier than he expected, and lifted the lid. The hinges creaked softly, and the smell of old paper and cedar rose up to meet him. Inside, carefully arranged, were bundles of letters tied with ribbon. Photographs in envelopes, a leather journal with a cracked spine, and various small items wrapped in cloth. Silas reached in and lifted out the first bundle of letters. The envelopes were yellowed with age, addressed in careful cursive to someone named Thomas Ray. Care of this very address, Route 2, Box 47, Cedar Ridge Ray, the same as his own last name. Silas felt something shift in his chest, a strange tightening that might have been anticipation or might have been dread. He untied the ribbon and pulled out the first letter. The paper crackled slightly as he unfolded it. The date at the top read June 15th, 1952. He began to read. The moment Silas saw his own surname on those yellowed envelopes, something cold settled in his stomach. Ray wasn't an uncommon name, he told himself. Plenty of Rays scattered across the West, no relation to each other at all. But the coincidence made his hands unsteady as he unfolded that first letter. The handwriting was feminine, looping and graceful, written in faded blue ink that had turned almost purple with age. The paper felt fragile between his fingers, like it might crumble if he wasn't careful. "My dearest Thomas," it began, "the summer here is hot and endless, and I find myself thinking of the mountains where you are, imagining the cool pines and the sound of that creek you described. Little Margaret asks about you every day. She's 3 now, can you believe it? She has your eyes, that same deep brown that sees more than most people do." Silas read on, his throat tight. The letter spoke of everyday things. A garden coming in, neighbors helping with a roof repair, the price of flour at the general store. But woven through the mundane details was a thread of longing, of a woman separated from her husband, raising their daughter alone while he worked somewhere far away. It was signed, "Forever yours, Eleanor." He set that letter aside and reached for another. This one was dated 3 months later, September 1952. Eleanor wrote about Margaret starting to talk in full sentences, about the first frost coming early that year, about missing Thomas so much some nights she couldn't sleep. She mentioned his brother James had stopped by to check on them, had brought venison and stayed to fix the fence. His brother James. Silas felt the world tilt slightly. His own father's name had been James Ray, but his father had never mentioned a brother named Thomas, never spoken of any family beyond his own parents, both of whom had died when Silas was young. He read letter after letter, watching Eleanor's life unfold in careful cursive. Thomas worked in logging camps, it seemed, and mining operations, going where the work was, sending money home when he could. Eleanor raised their daughter and waited. The letters spanned years, 1952, 1953, 1954, each one a window into a life that felt both foreign and familiar. In a letter from 1955, Eleanor mentioned being pregnant again. "I pray this child will know its father better than Margaret has known you," she wrote. "I understand the work must be done, that you're building something for our future. But Thomas, we need you here. Margaret asked me yesterday why her daddy lives in the mountains instead of with us. I didn't know what to tell her." Silas set the letters down and reached for the journal. It was bound in brown leather, worn soft with handling. The pages inside were filled with a different handwriting, masculine, blocky, less graceful, but still readable. The name on the first page read, Thomas James Ray, 1951. His hands shook as he opened to the first entry. "Started work at the Cedar Ridge camp today," it read. The mountains here are different from back home, bigger, wilder. Got assigned to the North Crew. The foreman says there's good timber up the valley, and they'll need loggers through winter. Pay is decent. Might finally be able to save enough to buy our own place. Silas flipped through the pages, reading entries at random. Thomas wrote about the work, about men he met, about the forest and the weather. But mostly he wrote about missing his family. Saw a little girl in town today, about Margaret's age, one entry read. Made my chest hurt thinking about what I'm missing. But a man's got to provide. That's what my father always said, and he was right. Another entry, dated winter 1953. Got a letter from Eleanor today. Margaret's sick with a fever. Eleanor sounds scared. I should be there, but I can't leave now. Foreman says, if I quit in the middle of winter, I won't get my back pay. Need that money. God, I hope the girl pulls through. The entries became less frequent as the years went on, sometimes months between writings. The tone grew darker. James came by the camp today, one entry read. Says Eleanor needs more help than he can give. Says Margaret barely remembers me. Maybe he's right. Maybe I've been gone too long. Silas had to stop reading. His heart hammered in his chest, and his vision had gone blurry at the edges. He stood and walked to the window, breathing in the cold air, trying to make sense of what he'd found. His father, James Ray, had always been a quiet man, given more to silence than conversation. He'd worked as a ranch hand, married late in life to Silas's mother, and raised Silas with firm kindness but little warmth. He'd never spoken of his past, never mentioned siblings or family beyond the bare facts. When Silas had asked as a boy, his father had said simply, "The past is the past, son. No use digging in it." But here was evidence of a brother, Thomas, who'd lived in this very cabin, who'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to build something for his family, who'd slowly lost them while he was away. Silas returned to the chest and pulled out the photographs. They were black and white, their edges scalloped in the style of the era. The first showed a young woman, Eleanor presumably, holding a baby. She had dark hair pulled back, a serious expression, eyes that looked directly at the camera with something like defiance. The baby was wrapped in a white blanket, only its face visible. Another photo showed a little girl, maybe 4 or 5, standing in front of a house Silas didn't recognize. She wore a dress and had ribbons in her hair. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, Margaret, 1955. There were more photos, Eleanor and Margaret at different ages, the girl growing taller, her face losing its baby roundness. In the later photos, a man appeared sometimes, standing slightly apart from Eleanor and Margaret. He was tall and lean, wearing work clothes. His face had a stern quality, but his eyes were kind. Silas studied that face, looking for something familiar, some echo of his own father, and he found it. The set of the jaw, the way the man held his shoulders. It was subtle, but it was there. This was Thomas Ray, and he was almost certainly his father's brother. But there was one more photograph, smaller than the rest, tucked into an envelope at the bottom of the chest. Silas pulled it out carefully. This one showed 3 people, Thomas, Eleanor, and between them, holding both their hands, little Margaret. They stood in front of this very cabin, Silas realized, recognizing the log walls and the stone chimney. The date on the back read 1956, so Thomas had brought his family here at some point. This cabin had been his dream, the place he'd worked all those years to afford. Had they lived here? For how long? Silas dug deeper into the chest. Beneath the photos and letters, wrapped in a piece of cloth, he found a small Bible. Inside the front cover, written in Eleanor's careful script, was a family record, Thomas James Ray, born April 3, 1925, Eleanor May Winters Ray, born August 12, 1927, married June 9, 1949, Margaret Rose Ray, born March 15, 1952, Samuel Thomas Ray, born December 8, 1955, Samuel, a second child. The letter from 1955 had mentioned Eleanor being pregnant, but Silas hadn't found any later references to the baby. He looked through the photos again. No pictures of a baby or young boy beyond Margaret. At the very bottom of the chest, he found one more item. A folded piece of paper, official-looking, with a county seal at the top. It was a death certificate. Silas unfolded it with trembling hands. Samuel Thomas Ray, it read. Born December 8, 1955. Died February 3rd, 1956. Cause of death, pneumonia. Age 8 weeks. The paper blurred as Silas read it. 8 weeks old. The baby had lived for only 8 weeks. He imagined Eleanor holding her infant son, watching him struggle to breathe, powerless to save him. He imagined Thomas getting the news, probably by telegram or letter, too far away to make it home in time. Silas sat down heavily in the old armchair, dust rising around him. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of tragedy and loss. Thomas had worked away from his family, trying to build a future. His son had died while he was gone. And then what? Had the grief driven them apart? Had Eleanor blamed him for not being there? He picked up the journal again and flipped toward the end. The last entries were from 1957, more than a year after the baby's death. Eleanor says she can't stay here anymore, Thomas had written. Too many memories in these walls. Margaret cries at night. We're going back to town, going to stay with Eleanor's sister. I thought this place would be our home, our fresh start. Instead, it's become a tomb for our boy. I don't blame Eleanor for wanting to leave. Some places hold too much sorrow to ever feel right again. The final entry, dated September 12th, 1957, was short. Locked up the cabin today. Eleanor and Margaret are gone. Said she needs space, needs time. Said I'm always gone anyway, so what does it matter? She's right. I've been chasing something that doesn't exist. The idea that hard work and money can make up for not being there. James is going to look after them. He's a better man than I am. I don't know what happens now. After that, nothing. No more entries. Silas flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. He sat in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the remnants of his uncle's broken dreams, and felt the weight of it settle over him like a heavy coat. Thomas Ray had been his uncle, though they'd never met. These letters and photos and journal entries were all that remained of a man who'd worked himself to exhaustion, lost his son, lost his wife, and ended up alone, just like Silas himself. The parallel was too clear to miss. Hadn't he done the same thing in a way? Worked long hours on the ranch, always one more fence to mend, one more pasture to clear, one more season to get through. Emma had never complained, had always supported his work, but looking back now, he wondered how many evenings he'd missed, how many conversations he'd cut short because he was tired, how many moments had slipped past while he was focused on the doing instead of the being. The difference was he'd had Emma until the end. They'd grown old together, had decades of shared mornings and quiet evenings. Thomas had lost that chance. But what had happened to Thomas? And to Eleanor and Margaret? Had they reconciled? Had Thomas ever seen his daughter grow up? And where did his father, James, fit into all of this? Silas realized that the story wasn't complete. The chest held the beginning and the middle, but not the end. If he wanted to know how it finished, he'd have to dig deeper. Outside, Maple brayed softly, reminding him that the day was passing. Silas stood, his knees protesting, and walked to the door. The sun was already past its peak, sliding toward afternoon. He'd been reading for hours, lost in the past. He needed to think, needed to process what he'd found. But more than that, he needed to decide what to do with this information. These letters and photos weren't just historical artifacts. They were pieces of his own family history, connections to people he'd never known, but who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. For now, he'd return the items to the chest and keep them safe. Tomorrow, he'd start asking questions. The real estate agent might know something about the cabin's history. There might be old-timers in the nearest town who remembered the Ray family. And there was always the county courthouse where records were kept, where births and deaths and marriages were documented. Silas carefully returned everything to the cedar chest, making sure each letter was in its envelope, each photo protected. He closed the lid gently, as if closing a door on a room where someone was sleeping. Then he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, and for the first time since Emma died, he felt something other than the weight of grief. He felt curiosity. He felt purpose. He had a mystery to solve, a story to uncover. And in the process, he might just find the pieces of himself he'd thought were lost forever. The next morning, Silas woke before dawn, his mind already turning over questions that had kept him restless through the night. He made coffee and fed Maple, then stood in the clearing, watching the sun break over the ridge, painting the pine tops gold. The air was crisp enough to show his breath, a reminder that winter was coming, and the cabin was nowhere near ready for the cold. But first, he needed answers. He locked the cedar chest in the truck's toolbox, not wanting to leave it unprotected in the cabin while he was gone. Then he loaded Maple into the trailer and headed back down the mountain road toward Cedar Ridge, the closest town, about 15 miles away. Cedar Ridge wasn't much, a main street with a post office, a general store, a diner, and a handful of other buildings that looked like they'd been holding their ground against time with stubborn determination. The population sign at the town limit claimed 212 residents, but Silas suspected that number was optimistic. He parked in front of the diner, a place called Mountain View Cafe, and went inside. The morning crowd consisted of 5 older men, scattered among the booths and counter stools, all of them turning to look at him with the frank curiosity of people whose daily routine didn't include many strangers. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, came over with a coffee pot. "Morning," she said, her smile genuine. "You just passing through or staying a while?" "Staying, actually," Silas said, settling onto a stool. "Just bought the old cabin up on Forest Service Road 242. The conversation in the diner didn't exactly stop, but it changed tenor." The men glanced at each other, and the waitress's eyebrows went up. "The Ray place?" she asked. "Hasn't been lived in for, must be 20 years now." "You knew the people who lived there?" Silas asked, feeling his pulse quicken. "Can't say I knew them personally," she said, pouring his coffee. "That place was abandoned long before I moved here, and that was in 95. But folks around here remember the story. Tragic, really." She paused. "You want breakfast? We've got biscuits and gravy, eggs anyway, bacon or sausage." "Biscuits and gravy sound good," Silas said. "And I'd appreciate hearing that story, if you don't mind telling it." She called his order back to the kitchen, then leaned against the counter. "Well, like I said, I only know what people have told me. The cabin was built by a man named Thomas Ray back in the 50s sometime. He was a logger, worked the camps up in the high country. Built that place thinking he'd retire there with his family. But things didn't work out that way. One of the men at the counter, an elderly fellow in a fleece vest and John Deere cap, spoke up. "I remember Thomas," he said. "Worked with him one summer at the mill. Good man, but quiet. Carried something heavy, you could tell. Never talked much about personal matters. What happened to him?" Silas asked. The man in the cap shook his head. "Nobody knows for sure. He lived up there alone for years after his wife left. Some people saw him in town now and then buying supplies, but he kept to himself. Then one winter, must have been 63 or 64, he just disappeared. Some folks thought he'd gone to find his wife and daughter. Others figured he'd died up there and nobody found the body. The cabin sat empty after that. The waitress brought Silas's breakfast, and he ate while listening to the fragments of story the locals remembered. It was like assembling a puzzle with pieces missing. Thomas had been alone at the cabin. Eleanor and Margaret had gone back to live with Eleanor's family somewhere in Oregon, or maybe it was Idaho. Nobody was certain. There had been another man involved, Thomas's brother maybe, who'd helped Eleanor after the marriage fell apart. "There's one person who might know more," the waitress said. "Vera Mitchell. She's 93 now, lives in the assisted living place over in Pinewood. That's the next town west. She was the postmaster here for 40 years, and she knew everybody's business. If anyone would remember the details, it'd be Vera." Silas finished his breakfast and paid, leaving a generous tip. He asked for directions to Pinewood and the name of the assisted living facility, Cedar Hills Memory Care, then headed back to his truck. Maple gave him a patient look when he returned. "I know," Silas told her. "This is supposed to be about fixing up the cabin, not chasing ghosts. But I need to know. Pinewood was 20 miles west, a slightly larger town with a proper grocery store and a couple of gas stations. Cedar Hills Memory Care sat on a rise at the north end of town, a low brick building with well-maintained grounds and a parking lot half full of cars. Inside, the place smelled of cleaning products and something Silas couldn't quite identify, not unpleasant, just institutional. The woman at the front desk, young and professionally friendly, looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "I'm hoping to visit with Vera Mitchell if she's receiving visitors," Silas said. "Oh, Vera loves visitors," the woman said, her smile widening. "She's sharp as a tack, too. You family?" "No, ma'am. I just bought a property near Cedar Ridge and was told Vera might remember the people who used to live there. Let me see if she's in her room." The woman picked up a phone, spoke briefly, then nodded. "She says to come on back. Room 1-14, down that hallway and to the left." Silas found the room easily. The door was open, and inside, a tiny woman sat in a recliner by the window, a thick book open in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You the fellow asking about the old Ray place?" she said, her voice surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Yes, ma'am. Silas Ray." He stepped into the room, suddenly uncertain. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Ray?" Vera's eyebrows went up. "Well, that's interesting. Come in, sit down. There's a chair right there." Silas pulled a chair close to her recliner and sat. Vera studied him with open curiosity. "You related to Thomas Ray?" she asked. "I think so," Silas said. "That's part of why I'm here. I found some letters and photos in the cabin. Thomas Ray seems to have been my father's brother, though I never knew my father had a brother." Vera nodded slowly. "That makes sense. James, your father, I'm guessing, didn't like to talk about Thomas. They had a falling out, you see." "A bad one? Over Eleanor?" Silas asked. "You do know some of it then," Vera said. "Yes, over Eleanor. Though it wasn't what you might think. It wasn't some sordid affair or anything like that. It was simpler and more complicated all at once." She closed her book and set it aside, settling deeper into her chair. "I was postmaster in Cedar Ridge from 1951 to 1991, 40 years. I processed every letter that came through that town, and back then, people wrote letters. I got to know everyone's handwriting, their habits. The Rays, Thomas and Eleanor, they wrote to each other constantly when Thomas was working the camps. I found those letters," Silas said, "in a chest in the cabin. Then you know Thomas was gone more than he was home," Vera said. "He was trying to save up enough money to buy land, build a proper home for his family. Noble goal, but hard on a marriage. Hard on children." She paused, looking out the window at the mountains visible in the distance. "When their baby died, Samuel, it broke something in Eleanor. She blamed herself, but she also blamed Thomas for not being there. The baby got sick, pneumonia, and by the time they got him to a doctor, it was too late. Thomas was in a camp 60 miles away. He didn't even know Samuel was sick until James showed up to tell him the baby had died." Silas felt the weight of that. Imagining the grief and guilt, Eleanor moved out of the cabin with Margaret, Vera continued. Went to stay with her sister in Bend, Oregon. Thomas kept working, kept sending money, but the distance, physical and emotional, just grew. James tried to help. He'd check on Eleanor and Margaret, make sure they had what they needed. He was younger than Thomas, not married yet, and he had a steady job at a ranch outside of town. "And that caused problems?" Silas asked. "It did," Vera said quietly. "Not because anything inappropriate happened. At least I never believed it did. But Thomas saw his brother stepping into the role he'd abandoned. Saw James being there for his wife and daughter while he was off in the mountains. The resentment built up. When Thomas finally came back to Cedar Ridge, there was a confrontation. I don't know exactly what was said, but after that the brothers never spoke again." "What happened to Eleanor and Margaret?" Silas asked. "Eleanor eventually divorced Thomas. It was 1960, I think. She married again a few years later, a man from Bend. Margaret grew up there, went to school, had a normal life. Thomas stayed at the cabin alone. James moved away in 62, went down to eastern Oregon to work on a ranch there. That's where he met your mother, I assume." "Yes," Silas said. "They married in 63. I was born in 52, Vera smiled. So you're 73? You look good for it. Better than I do, and I'm only 20 years older. She chuckled at her own joke, then grew serious again. Thomas disappeared in the winter of '64. There was a big storm that year, snowed people in for weeks. When the roads finally cleared, someone went to check on Thomas and found the cabin empty. No note, no sign of struggle. His truck was gone. Most people figured he'd finally left, maybe went to try to find Eleanor or Margaret, but nobody ever heard from him again. Did anyone look for him? Silas asked. Not really. He was a grown man, and there was no evidence of foul play. The sheriff filed a report, but without any leads, it went nowhere. The cabin sat empty. Nobody wanted to buy it, too remote, too run down, and it had a sad history. Eventually, the county took it for unpaid taxes, and it's been sold a few times since then for cheap, but nobody ever stuck around to fix it up. Silas sat quietly, absorbing all of this. His uncle Thomas had spent his last years alone in that cabin, haunted by loss and regret, and then had simply vanished. His father, James, had carried the guilt of a fractured brotherhood to his grave, never speaking of it, never trying to reconcile. Did Eleanor or Margaret ever come back? He asked. Not that I know of, Vera said. Once Eleanor remarried, she cut ties with Cedar Ridge completely. Can't blame her, really. This place held nothing but painful memories for her. Do you know if Margaret is still alive, or where she might be? Vera shook her head. I don't, I'm sorry. But if you're determined to find out, you could try the county clerk's office. They keep records of births, deaths, marriages. You might be able to trace her that way. Silas stood. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. You've been more helpful than you know. One more thing, Vera said as he turned to leave. She reached for a small address book on the table beside her chair and flipped through it. There's a woman named Alice Porter who lives over in Bend. She was Eleanor's younger sister. Last I heard, she was still alive, would be in her 80s now. If anyone knows what happened to Eleanor and Margaret, it would be Alice. She wrote down an address on a slip of paper and handed it to Silas. He took it, folded it carefully, and tucked it in his shirt pocket. Why are you doing this? Vera asked, studying him with those sharp eyes. Digging up old family history. Some things are better left buried. Silas thought about that. Maybe, he said. But I've spent the last 5 years trying to outrun my own grief. I think maybe understanding where I came from, understanding the mistakes my family made, might help me figure out where I'm going. Vera nodded slowly. That's a wise answer. You've got some of Thomas in you, I think. He was a thoughtful man, just too stubborn to see when he was wrong. Maybe you can do better. I hope so, Silas said. Thank you again. He drove back to the cabin as the afternoon stretched toward evening, his mind full of new information and new questions. The story was taking shape, but it was a sad one, marked by loss and missed chances and words left unspoken. When he got back to the clearing, Maple greeted him with her usual calm patience. He let her out to graze and stood for a moment looking at the cabin. This place had been Thomas's dream and his tragedy. It had witnessed the collapse of a family, the death of a child, the slow erosion of a marriage, but it was also still standing, still here, waiting. Maybe that meant something. Maybe places, like people, could be given second chances. Silas spent the rest of the day working on the cabin, clearing out more junk, sweeping decades of dirt and debris from the floors. The physical work felt good, felt purposeful. But in the back of his mind, he was already planning his next move. He would go to Bend, Oregon. He would try to find Alice Porter, and through her, maybe Eleanor and Margaret. He would complete the story Thomas had left unfinished, and then maybe, just maybe, he could begin to write his own ending. 3 days later, Silas stood on a porch in Bend, Oregon, his hat in his hands. The house was small but well-maintained, with flower boxes in the windows and a neat lawn bordered by river rocks. A cat watched him from a windowsill, its tail twitching slowly. He debated this visit for all 3 of those days, working on the cabin, while his mind wrestled with whether he had any right to intrude on these people's lives. But in the end, the need to know had won out over his doubts. He knocked, 3 firm raps on the wooden door. A minute passed, then another. He was about to knock again when the door opened. A woman stood there, small and silver-haired, leaning on a cane. She wore a cardigan despite the mild weather, and her eyes, blue and still sharp, studied him with polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Mrs. Porter?" "Alice Porter?" Silas asked. "That's right. My name is Silas Ray. I'm sorry to show up unannounced, but I was hoping I could talk to you about your sister." "Eleanor," the woman's expression changed. A flicker of something, surprise, wariness, passing across her face. "Eleanor? Why would you want to know about Eleanor?" "Because I think she was married to my uncle, Thomas Ray, and I'd like to understand what happened to them." Alice Porter stood silent for a long moment, her hand tightening on the doorframe. Then she sighed. "You'd better come in." Inside, the house was warm and cluttered in a comfortable way, photos on every surface, books stacked on end tables, a throw blanket draped over a well-worn couch. Alice led him to the living room and gestured to a chair. "Sit, I'll make tea." "You don't have to." "I do, if we're going to talk about Eleanor," she said firmly. "Some conversations require tea." She disappeared into the kitchen and Silas sat, feeling awkward. He looked at the photos on the nearby shelf. One showed two young women, one of them clearly Alice from the resemblance, the other dark-haired and serious-looking. Eleanor, he guessed. Alice returned with 2 mugs and handed one to him. She settled into the couch with a care that spoke of old bones and aching joints. "So," she said, "Thomas's nephew. I didn't know he had any family." "He and my father were estranged," Silas said. "I only recently found out he existed." "Estranged." Alice sipped her tea. "That's a polite word for it. They hated each other by the end, from what Eleanor told me." "What happened?" Silas asked. Alice was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "Everything and nothing, I suppose. Thomas wasn't a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He loved Eleanor, loved Margaret. But he didn't know how to be there for them. He thought providing meant working, meant being gone, meant sacrifice. And maybe in some ways he was right. But Eleanor needed more than money. She needed a husband who came home at night, a father for her daughter who was present." She set her mug down. "When Samuel died, something broke in Eleanor that never really healed. She blamed herself for not getting him to the doctor sooner, blamed Thomas for not being there, blamed God for taking her baby. She spiraled into a dark place for a while. Your Uncle James, he was kind to her during that time. He'd come by, bring food, play with Margaret, just sit with Eleanor when she couldn't stop crying. And Thomas resented that, Silas said. He did. Saw it as interference, as James trying to replace him. There was a fight, physical from what I heard. James got the worst of it. Thomas was bigger, stronger. But James had said some things that needed saying. About Thomas being a coward, about running away to the mountains instead of facing his family's pain. After that, they never spoke again. What happened to Eleanor? Silas asked gently. Alice's eyes grew misty. She divorced Thomas in 1960. It wrecked her to do it. She'd loved him fiercely once, but she couldn't live in that limbo anymore, waiting for a man who was never really there. She moved here to Bend, stayed with me for a few years. Eventually she met William, a good man, steady. They married in 1964. He adopted Margaret, gave her his name, Porter. Margaret Porter, Silas said, committing it to memory. Eleanor and William had a good life together, Alice continued. Not passionate like she and Thomas had been, but stable, warm. They raised Margaret here. Eleanor worked at the library, William at a lumber mill. They were happy enough, I think. But Eleanor never really let go of Samuel. Kept his baby blanket in a drawer, looked at his picture every night. Some losses you don't get over, you just learn to carry them. Is Eleanor still alive? Silas asked, though something in Alice's face made him already know the answer. She passed in 2008, Alice said quietly. Cancer. She was 81. William went 3 years later. They're buried together at the Pilot Butte Cemetery just outside of town. Silas felt a strange grief for a woman he'd never met, this aunt by marriage who'd carried so much sorrow. And Margaret? He asked. Alice smiled, the first real smile since he'd arrived. Margaret's alive and well. She lives in Portland, has 2 grown sons of her own, grandchildren. She's a social worker, helps families in crisis. I think she chose that work because of her own childhood, wanting to help people the way no one quite helped Eleanor. Would she be willing to talk to me? Silas asked. Alice studied him carefully. Why do you want to talk to her? What is it you're really looking for, Mr. Ray? Silas took a breath. I'm 73 years old. My wife died 5 years ago. I've spent that time drifting, not really living, just existing. I bought Thomas's old cabin without knowing it was his, and I found all these letters and photos. Learning about Thomas and Eleanor, about how they lost each other, it's made me think about my own life, my own mistakes. I guess I'm looking for... He paused, searching for the right words. I'm looking for some kind of understanding, some way to make sense of loss and regret, and maybe some way to do better with whatever time I have left. Alice's expression softened. She reached for a notebook on the side table and wrote something down, then tore out the page and handed it to him. That's Margaret's phone number. Call her, explain who you are and why you're reaching out. She's a good listener, comes with the job, and I think she'd be interested in meeting you. She's always wondered about her father's family. She never met Thomas. Silas asked, surprised. Not after she was 5 or 6? Eleanor kept her away, thought it would be easier for Margaret not to be caught between them. Maybe that was right, maybe it wasn't. But Margaret's always felt that absence, always wondered about the father she barely remembered. Silas stood, tucking the paper carefully into his pocket. Thank you, Mrs. Porter, for the tea and for sharing all this. Alice, she corrected. If you're family, even distantly, call me Alice. She walked him to the door, moving slowly with her cane. Mr. Ray, Silas, one more thing. Whatever you find out, whatever Margaret tells you, remember that people are complicated. Thomas wasn't a villain, and Eleanor wasn't a victim. They were just two people who loved each other, but couldn't quite figure out how to make it work. Life's like that sometimes. I know, Silas said. Believe me, I know. He drove back to Cedar Ridge with the setting sun, painting the sky orange and purple, thinking about all he'd learned. The story was almost complete now. He had most of the pieces. But there was still one more conversation to have, one more connection to make. When he got back to the cabin, full dark had fallen. He built a fire in the clearing and sat watching the flames while Maple dozed nearby. Tomorrow he'd call Margaret. Tomorrow he'd take the next step. But tonight he just sat with the story, with all the sadness and missed chances and love that hadn't been enough. He thought about Emma, about their life together, about the ways he might have done better, been more present, said more of what he felt instead of showing it only through work and action. It was too late to change any of that. But it wasn't too late to learn from it, and maybe that was what Thomas's story was meant to teach him. Not that life was tragic and loss inevitable, but that the time you have matters, and how you use it makes all the difference. The fire burned down to coals, and Silas climbed into his sleeping bag in the truck bed. Before sleep took him, he made himself a promise. When he talked to Margaret, he wouldn't just ask about the past. He'd ask about the future, too. About what came after grief, about how she'd built a life despite the broken pieces of her childhood. Because that was what he needed to learn. Not how to avoid pain, that was impossible, but how to build something meaningful, even after everything fell apart. 2 days later, Silas sat at a small cafe in Portland, Oregon, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the door. Margaret Porter, or Margaret Porter Williams, as she'd introduced herself on the phone, had agreed to meet him, though he'd heard the hesitation in her voice, the uncertainty about dredging up old family history. But she'd said yes, and now here he was, 5 hours' drive from the cabin, waiting to meet his cousin he'd never known he had. He'd cleaned up for the occasion, put on his newer jeans and a pressed shirt, trimmed his beard. Looking at his reflection in the cafe window, he saw an old man trying to make a good impression, and the thought made him smile despite his nervousness. The door opened, and a woman in her early 70s walked in. She had grey, streaked brown hair cut short, wore practical clothes, slacks and a sweater, and carried herself with a confident ease. Her eyes scanned the cafe, and when they landed on Silas, she paused. He saw the recognition there, saw her seeing something familiar in his face. He stood, and she walked over. Silas Ray? She asked. Margaret. Thank you for coming. He gestured to the chair across from him. Can I get you anything?" "Coffee black," she said, sitting. Her voice was steady, measured, the voice of someone used to difficult conversations. "This is strange, isn't it? Meeting family you never knew existed." "It is," Silas agreed. He went to the counter, ordered her coffee, and brought it back. They sat in silence for a moment, sizing each other up. "Aunt Alice said you bought my father's cabin," Margaret finally said. "That you found letters and photos." "I did." Silas pulled out his phone, a simple flip model that took him a moment to figure out, and showed her a photo he'd taken of one of the letters. "Your mother wrote these to Thomas while he was working in the logging camps." Margaret took the phone, squinting at the small screen. Her expression was hard to read. "I don't remember much about that time," she said. "I was only 5 when my mother and I left. Most of what I know, I learned later from her or from Aunt Alice." "What do you remember?" Silas asked gently. She handed back the phone and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Fragments, mostly. A cabin in the woods, bigger in my memory than it probably was. My mother crying. A tall man who would show up sometimes. I thought he was my father, but later I realized it was probably James trying to help. And cold. I remember being cold, and my mother bundling me in blankets." "That would have been the winter your brother died?" Silas said quietly. Margaret's eyes met his, and he saw old pain there. "Samuel, yes, I didn't understand at the time what had happened. I just knew my mother was sad, and then we left, and I never saw the cabin again. My mother didn't talk about Thomas much after she remarried. William was a good father to me, patient, kind, present. Everything Thomas apparently wasn't." There was an edge to her voice, not quite bitter but close. Silas understood it. Whatever Thomas's intentions had been, his absence had marked Margaret's childhood. "I didn't know him," Silas said. "My father, Thomas's brother James, never mentioned having a brother. I grew up thinking we had no extended family, that my father's people were all gone. Finding out about Thomas, about you and Eleanor, it's been—" He struggled for the word. "Illuminating, I suppose. Understanding where my father's silence came from. What was James like?" Margaret asked, curiosity breaking through her reserve. "Quiet, hard-working, kind in his way, but not demonstrative. He married late, had me when he was nearly 40. My mother was younger, more outgoing, and I think she balanced him out. But he never talked about his past, never explained why we didn't have family gatherings or reunions. I assumed it was just how he was. Did he know about me?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Silas admitted. "If he did, he never said. But given that he and Thomas were estranged, and that he moved away from Cedar Ridge before you were old enough to remember him, I'd guess he might not have known you existed. Or if he did, he thought it was better to stay away." Margaret was quiet, processing this. "My mother told me once, near the end, that James had been kind to her during the worst time, that he'd helped when Thomas wouldn't, but she also said the brothers fighting had made everything harder, had forced her to choose sides when she just wanted Thomas to come home and be a husband and father. Did she ever regret divorcing him?" Silas asked. "She said she didn't," Margaret replied. "Said it was the best decision she could have made for me, to give me stability. But I think she did regret it in some ways. She kept a photo of Thomas hidden in her jewelry box. I found it after she died. He was young in it, handsome, smiling. Looked so different from the stern man in the few pictures I remember seeing as a child. I think she mourned the man he'd been, or the man she'd hoped he would become. Did she ever try to contact him later?" Silas asked. "Once, I think. Around 1963, after she'd married William. She told me she'd written to Thomas, sent the letter to the cabin, but never heard back. She didn't know if he'd received it, or just chose not to respond. Either way, it was the last time she reached out, the year before Thomas disappeared." Silas felt a chill. Had Thomas received that letter? Had it been the final straw that pushed him to leave, knowing Eleanor had moved on, knowing he'd truly lost her? "There's something I need to tell you," Silas said. "Thomas disappeared in the winter of 1964. Nobody knows what happened to him. The cabin was found empty, his truck gone. No note, no explanation. Some people think he died somewhere, others think he left to start over somewhere else." Margaret's face went still. "He disappeared?" "Yes, I'm sorry. I thought you might have known." "I didn't," Her voice was barely above a whisper. My mother never mentioned it. Maybe she didn't know, or maybe she knew and didn't want to burden me with it. God, to think he might have died alone somewhere. She stopped, her eyes glistening. Silas reached across the table and gently touched her hand. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. It's not your fault, Margaret said, wiping her eyes quickly. It's just, I spent so much of my life being angry at him for not being there, for abandoning us. And now to learn he might have died alone, possibly reaching out to my mother right before. She took a shaky breath. It makes it all more complicated. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the cafe swirling around them. Conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of dishes. Finally, Margaret spoke again. Why did you want to meet me, Silas? Really? He considered the question carefully. Because I'm trying to understand my own life by understanding Thomas's. I lost my wife 5 years ago, and I've been drifting since then, not sure what to do with myself. When I found those letters and journals, I saw a man who made mistakes, who lost the people he loved because he was too focused on providing instead of being present. I saw pieces of myself in that, and pieces of my father. And I thought if I could understand what happened to Thomas, to Eleanor, to you, maybe I could figure out how to live the rest of my own life better. Margaret studied him for a long moment. That's honest, she said. Most people aren't that honest. She smiled slightly. I spend my days working with families in crisis, trying to help people communicate, trying to prevent the kind of breakdown that happened to my parents. And do you know what the most common problem is? People assuming they know what their loved ones need without actually asking. People showing love through actions but never words, or words but never actions, and somehow never quite connecting. That sounds like Thomas and Eleanor, Silas said. It sounds like most people, Margaret corrected gently. My parents weren't unique in their failure. They were just unlucky in its timing and consequences. But the lesson is universal. You can't just work at love and you can't just feel it. You have to do both, and you have to do them where the other person can see and feel them. Emma, my wife, she tried to tell me that sometimes, Silas said. I'd be working on some fence or some project, and she'd say, Silas, I don't need a perfect ranch. I need you. And I'd tell her I was doing it for us, for our future. But what I was really doing was hiding in work, because it was easier than being vulnerable, easier than sitting still and just being with her. Did you ever tell her that? Margaret asked. No, I only figured it out after she was gone. Then tell someone else, Margaret said firmly. Tell me, tell anyone who matters to you. Don't let the pattern repeat. Silas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of something that had been tight for years. You're right, he said simply. They talked for another hour, trading stories about their lives. Margaret told him about her work, her sons, her grandchildren. Silas told her about the ranch he and Emma had built, about the years of work and small joys, about Maple the donkey who'd become his faithful companion in widowhood. What are you going to do with the cabin? Margaret asked as they prepared to leave. Fix it up, Silas said. Make it livable again. It feels like something I need to do, both for Thomas and for myself. Like giving the place a second chance. I'd like to see it someday, Margaret said. When it's ready, I think I'd like to see where I was born, where my brother died. I think I need to, actually, to make peace with that part of my history. You're welcome any time, Silas said. He pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down his cell phone number. Call me and we'll arrange it. Maybe next spring, when the weather's better and I've made more progress. They hugged goodbye in the cafe parking lot, an awkward embrace between two near strangers who'd just become family. But it felt right. Felt like a beginning of something. Driving back to Cedar Ridge, Silas felt lighter than he had in years. He'd followed the thread of Thomas's story to its end, or as close to an end as he was likely to get. He'd found family he hadn't known existed, and he'd learned something important about himself, about the patterns he'd inherited and the choices he could still make. The cabin waited for him in its clearing, still dilapidated, still full of work. But now it felt different. It wasn't just a shelter anymore, wasn't just a place to hide from grief. It was a project with meaning, a restoration that was as much about himself as it was about the building. And when Margaret came to visit next spring, the cabin would be ready. It would be warm and solid and welcoming, everything it had never quite been for Thomas and Eleanor. That would be Silas's gift to them, and to himself, turning their broken dream into something whole again. Through the rest of October and into November, Silas worked on the cabin with a focus he hadn't felt since before Emma died. The physical labor felt good, the ache in his muscles each evening, the visible progress each day. He repaired the porch steps, replaced rotted windowsills, patched the roof where shingles had blown away. He worked methodically, doing things right rather than fast, the way his father had taught him. Maple grazed contentedly in her makeshift corral, and Silas found himself talking to her as he worked, narrating his day the way he used to narrate things to Emma. The donkey would flick her ears, and he'd take that as understanding enough. One afternoon, while pulling up rotted floorboards in the bedroom, Silas found something tucked between the joists, a small wooden box, crude and handmade, about the size of a cigar box. His heart quickened as he pried it free and brushed off the dust. Inside was a collection of items that clearly belonged to a child. Small toys, a wooden horse hand-carved and worn smooth with handling, a set of jacks, a few marbles in a cloth pouch. There was also a child's drawing, the paper yellowed and fragile, showing a house and two stick figures labeled in a child's scrawl, Mama and Me. Margaret's treasures, Silas realized. Things she'd hidden away, and then left behind when Eleanor took her away. He imagined a 5-year-old girl, hurting and confused, leaving pieces of her childhood in this place. He set the box aside carefully. He'd give it to Margaret when she came to visit. These things belonged to her, were part of her story. The work continued. He scraped away old chinking and applied fresh, sealing the gaps between logs. He cleaned out the fireplace and chimney, finding bird nests and years of accumulated soot, but discovering that the structure was sound. He'd be able to use it to heat the cabin through the winter that was fast approaching. The weather turned colder. Snow dusted the peaks above the tree line, and frost came most mornings. Silas bought a wood stove in Cedar Ridge, an efficient modern one, and installed it with proper venting. He insulated the attic space, hung heavy curtains over the windows, weather-stripped the doors. The cabin slowly became snug, capable of holding heat. He also made trips to town more regularly, and in doing so, became known to the locals. The men at the diner started greeting him by name. The woman at the general store, her name was Ruth, he learned, always asked after his progress on the cabin. The postmaster, a middle-aged man named Dennis, mentioned there was a community Thanksgiving to come. "I'm not much for crowds," Silas had said. "It's not a crowd," Dennis replied. "Maybe 40 people. Good food, though, and it beats eating alone." Silas promised to think about it. In the evenings, after the work was done, and he'd fed Maple and heated his simple dinner on the camp stove, Silas would sit by the fire he'd built in the restored fireplace and read through Thomas's journal again. He'd read it so many times now, he nearly had it memorized, but each time he found some new detail, some new insight into his uncle's state of mind. One entry from late 1957 stood out: "A man can build a house, but that doesn't make it a home." Eleanor understood that, tried to tell me, but I was too stubborn to listen. I thought walls and a roof and money in the bank were enough. Turns out what matters can't be built with hands or bought with wages. It has to be lived, has to be present. By the time I figured that out, it was too late. Silas thought about that often. Thought about his own marriage, his own tendency to show love through labor rather than presence. Emma had never complained outright, but looking back, he saw the times she'd needed him to stop working and just sit with her, just talk, just be. How often had he missed those cues? How many evenings had he given to one more task instead of to her? The difference was, he and Emma had grown old together. They'd had time to figure things out, time to soften their sharp edges against each other. Thomas and Eleanor hadn't gotten that chance. Their story had been cut short by grief and circumstance and pride, but Silas had time still. Not much at his age, but some. The question was what to do with it. The week before Thanksgiving, Ruth from the general store stopped by the cabin. Silas had told her she was welcome to visit, curious to see the progress, and she'd taken him up on it. She was a widow too. He'd learned, about 10 years younger than him, still working because she liked keeping busy. She brought a pie, apple, homemade, and walked through the cabin with genuine interest. "You've done remarkable work," she said, running her hand along the fresh chinking. "This place was a wreck last time I saw it years ago. Now it actually looks livable." "Getting there," Silas said. "Still needs furniture, curtains, about 1,000 small fixes, but it'll be warm for winter, and that's what matters." They sat on the porch, now solid and safe, and ate pie straight from the tin with forks. Maple wandered over to investigate, and Ruth laughed when the donkey tried to steal a bite. "She's got personality," Ruth observed. "She's been good company," Silas said. "Better than most people. Now that's saying something." Ruth smiled, and Silas found himself smiling back. She had an easy way about her, no pretense, just straightforward kindness. "You coming to the Thanksgiving dinner?" she asked. "I hadn't decided. You should come. I know you're used to being alone, but there's alone and then there's isolated. The first one's a choice. The second one's a trap." Her words stayed with him after she left. Was he isolated? He'd thought of himself as solitary, as someone who preferred his own company. But maybe the truth was he'd been hiding, first from the grief of losing Emma, and then from the risk of connecting with anyone new. That evening, he called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "Silas! How are you?" "Doing well. The cabin's coming along. I found something I think you'll want to see." He told her about the box of toys and the drawing. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I'd forgotten about those things. Didn't even realize I'd left them behind. But hearing about them now, God, it brings back memories. That wooden horse, my father made that. One of the few times I remember him being there, sitting at the table, carving it for me. I'll keep it safe until you can come get it," Silas promised. They talked for a while longer. Margaret told him about her granddaughter's upcoming school play, about her younger son getting a promotion at work. Silas told her about Ruth and the Thanksgiving invitation, and Margaret immediately said, "You should go. Don't sit up there alone on Thanksgiving." That's what Ruth said. "Then Ruth is a wise woman. You should listen to her." After they hung up, Silas sat in the quiet cabin, quiet but not silent, the fire crackling, the wind moving through the pines outside, and made a decision. He'd go to the Thanksgiving dinner. He'd take a chance on community, on connection. It's what Emma would have wanted for him. It's what Thomas should have done, instead of isolating himself in grief. Thanksgiving Day came cold and clear. Silas dressed in his best clothes, such as they were. Clean jeans, a button-up shirt, his good boots. He loaded a box of firewood into his truck as his contribution, figuring the church could always use it, and drove into Cedar Ridge. The community center behind the church was warm and noisy, full of people and food smells. Long tables had been set up, covered with dishes people had brought, turkey and ham, casseroles and rolls, pies and cakes. Children ran between the tables while adults talked and laughed. Silas stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. He'd spent so much time alone that this crowd felt overwhelming. He was about to turn around and leave when Ruth appeared at his elbow. "There you are. Come on, I'll introduce you around." She took his arm and pulled him into the crowd, making introductions. There was Dennis, the postmaster, and his wife Carol, the diner waitress, whose name turned out to be Helen, a couple named Frank and Sue who ran the hardware store. A man named Charlie, who'd worked in the logging camps in the 60s and remembered Thomas Ray slightly. He was a quiet one, Charlie said, shaking Silas's hand. Kept to himself mostly. Good worker, though. Never shirked a job. People were friendly, welcoming, curious about the old man who'd bought the Ray place and was fixing it up. They asked questions, told stories, included him in conversations. And slowly Silas felt himself relaxing into it, remembering how to be around people, how to be part of a community. During dinner, sitting between Ruth and an elderly woman named Martha who told stories about Cedar Ridge in the 50s, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged somewhere, not because of land or property, but because of people. Because of these simple connections over a shared meal. After dinner, while people were having pie and coffee, Dennis stood up and asked if anyone wanted to share what they were thankful for. It was a tradition, he explained, though no one was obligated. Several people spoke, thankful for family, for health, for another year. Then there was a pause, and Silas found himself standing up, surprising himself. "I'm Silas Ray," he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Most of you have met me already, but for those who haven't, I bought the old cabin up on Forest Service Road 242 a couple months ago. I came here thinking I was looking for a place to hide from my grief. My wife died 5 years ago, and I haven't known what to do with myself since." The room was quiet. People listening. But what I found instead of hiding place was a story, a sad story about my uncle and his family, about love and loss and missed chances. And through finding that story, I found something else, a reason to keep going, a reason to build something instead of just existing. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm thankful for this community, for welcoming me even though I'm just an old cowboy who doesn't know most of you. I'm thankful for the work I'm doing on the cabin, for having a purpose again. And I'm thankful that it's never too late to start over, to choose connection over isolation." He sat down to a smattering of applause, his face warm. Ruth patted his arm, smiling. After the dinner, as people were cleaning up, several folks came over to talk to him more. Martha invited him to the weekly coffee gathering at the diner. "Just a bunch of old-timers complaining about our joints," she said with a grin. Frank offered to help with any heavy work at the cabin. Helen mentioned there was a Christmas Eve service he might enjoy. Driving back to the cabin that evening, with leftover pie on the seat beside him and Maple's patient presence in the trailer behind, Silas felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone looking for rescue, but the quiet hope of someone who sees a path forward. He pulled into the clearing just as full dark settled. The cabin sat there, his work visible even in the dim light, the straight roofline, the sealed walls, the windows that now reflected lamplight instead of darkness. It was coming together, becoming something real. Inside, he built a fire in the fireplace and sat in the armchair he'd salvaged and reupholstered himself. The chair sat where Thomas's chair had probably sat, facing the same view of the door and windows. He thought about Thomas sitting here alone, year after year, consumed by regret and loss. But Silas wasn't going to follow that path. He was going to do something different. He was going to build not just a cabin, but a life, one that included other people, that made room for connection and community. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Margaret. He'd learned how, painstakingly, though it still took him forever to type. "Had Thanksgiving with new friends today. You were right. Wish Emma could see the cabin now. And think she'd be proud?" Margaret's response came quickly. She would be. "I'm proud too. See you in the spring, cousin. Cousin, family." The word filled something in him he hadn't known was empty. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the pines with white. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. And Silas Ray, 73 years old and still learning, settled into his chair and let himself feel at peace. December arrived with serious cold and snow that transformed the forest into something from a Christmas card. Silas worked on the cabin's interior now, building shelves, refinishing the old furniture, hanging curtains Ruth had helped him pick out in town. The place was taking shape, becoming not just livable but comfortable, even homey. He'd set up a proper kitchen area with the wood stove for cooking, installed a small propane refrigerator he'd bought used, and created a sleeping area in the bedroom with a new mattress and frame. The main room served as living space, with the fireplace as its heart. He'd even found an old radio at a yard sale and got it working, so he had music and news for company, but the real transformation was in himself. He went to town twice a week now, joining the coffee group at the diner on Tuesday mornings and stopping by the general store where Ruth would usually have time to chat. He learned the rhythms of the small community, the gossip and concerns, who was sick and who was celebrating. He wasn't alone on the mountain anymore. He was connected, part of something larger than himself. One afternoon in mid-December, while organizing the closet in the bedroom, Silas found something he'd missed in his earlier cleaning, a loose board in the closet floor. When he pried it up, he discovered a space beneath, and in that space a canvas bag. His heart racing, he pulled it out and opened it. Inside were more letters, these ones different from the ones in the cedar chest. They were addressed to Thomas, but had never been opened, still in their envelopes. All from the same sender, Eleanor Ray, with an address in Bend, Oregon. Silas counted them. 7 letters, dated between 1959 and 1963. He sat down on the bedroom floor, the bag in his lap. Thomas had received these letters, but hadn't opened them. Why pride? Fear? Or was he trying to protect himself from more pain? Carefully, Silas opened the first letter, dated February 1959. Eleanor's handwriting was the same, but her tone had changed, was more formal, more careful. "Thomas," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I know we haven't spoken in over a year, and I know our divorce will be final soon. But I wanted you to know that Margaret asks about you sometimes. She's growing up, doing well in school, but she remembers you. I thought you should know that." The letter went on to update him on Margaret's life, her interests, her friends, her progress in school. It was neither warm nor cold, just factual. Her bridge offered tentatively. Silas opened the next letter, from October 1959. This one mentioned that Eleanor had started seeing someone, a man named William. "He's kind to Margaret," she wrote. "Patient with her. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than through gossip." The third letter, from June 1960, was shorter. It informed Thomas that she and William would be married in the fall, and that William wanted to adopt Margaret if Thomas would agree to it. "I know this must be hard to hear," Eleanor wrote, "but Margaret needs a father who's present, who can be there for school plays and birthdays and all the small moments that matter. I hope you can understand and give your blessing." Had Thomas ever responded? Silas suspected not, or Eleanor wouldn't have kept writing. The fourth and fifth letters, from 1961 and 1962, were similar to the first, updates on Margaret's life, small details about her growing up, always ending with some variation of "she remembers you" or "she talks about you sometimes." The sixth letter, from March 1963, had a different tone. "Thomas," it began, "I'm writing to tell you that I'm at peace with how things turned out between us. I've had time to think, and I realize we were both doing the best we knew how. You were trying to provide for us in the only way you understood. I was trying to keep our family together. Neither of us was wrong exactly, but we couldn't find a way to meet in the middle. I wanted you to know that I don't carry anger anymore. I carry sadness for what we lost, but not anger." The seventh and final letter, dated November 1963, was the longest. Silas read it slowly, feeling the weight of Eleanor's words. "Thomas, this will be my last letter to you. Not because I'm angry or because I don't care, but because I think it's time to let go. Margaret is 11 now, growing into a wonderful young woman. She has William as a father, and he loves her like his own. She's happy, settled, doing well in school and life. That's what I wanted for her, what we both wanted. Even if we couldn't achieve it together, I want you to know that I loved you, Thomas. I loved you fiercely and completely, and part of me always will. But I've learned that love isn't enough without presence, without communication, without the willingness to be vulnerable and admit when you're wrong. We both failed at that, you and I. We were too proud, too hurt, too young to know better. I hope you found peace up there in the mountains. I hope you've built the life you wanted. And I hope that someday, if Margaret asks about you, I can tell her that her father was a good man who did his best, even if his best wasn't quite enough. Take care of yourself, Thomas. Be well. And if you're ever ready to be part of Margaret's life, even from a distance, you know where we are. With love and forgiveness, Eleanor." Silas set the letter down with shaking hands. Eleanor had offered him forgiveness, had offered him a way back into his daughter's life, and Thomas had never opened the letters. had never read these words, had probably died or left, still carrying his guilt and regret, never knowing that Eleanor had let go of her anger. It was heartbreaking. But it was also instructive. Thomas had isolated himself so completely that he'd missed the chance for healing, for reconciliation. His pride or his pain had trapped him in that cabin with his regrets, and he'd never found a way out. Silas wouldn't make the same mistake. He'd learned from Thomas's story, had seen where isolation and unspoken feelings led. He'd spend his remaining years differently, connected, present, willing to be vulnerable. He carefully refolded the letters and put them back in the canvas bag. These too he'd give to Margaret. She deserved to know that her mother had never stopped caring about Thomas, had never stopped trying to build a bridge. That evening, Silas called Margaret and told her about the letters. My mother kept writing to him. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. Even after the divorce, even after she remarried. She did. 7 letters over 4 years. She offered him forgiveness, offered him a place in your life, and he never opened them. It wasn't a question. No, I think he was too hurt or too ashamed. Maybe he thought he didn't deserve her forgiveness. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. That's so sad, Silas. They were both reaching out in their own ways, but never quite connecting. If he'd just opened one letter, just read one. I know, Silas said. But that's the lesson, isn't it? We have to be willing to receive love and forgiveness, not just offer it. We have to be open to healing. You've gotten wise in your old age, cousin, Margaret said, and he could hear the smile in her voice despite her tears. I've had good teachers, Silas replied. Your parents taught me what not to do. My wife taught me what love looks like. And you're teaching me what it means to build family. After they said goodbye, Silas sat by the fire and thought about Thomas and Eleanor, about all the things they'd left unsaid, all the chances they'd missed. Their story had ended in tragedy, or at least in sadness. But it didn't have to be meaningless. Their mistakes could teach. Their losses could illuminate the path forward for others. That's what Silas would carry forward, not just the cabin, but the lessons. He'd live openly, would say the things that needed saying, would accept love and forgiveness when they were offered. The snow fell outside, blanketing the forest in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled warm, and the cabin held steady against the cold. Silas sat in his armchair and felt for the first time in years truly at home. Not because he had 4 walls and a roof, but because he'd finally understood what Emma had been trying to tell him all along. Home isn't a place you build. It's a feeling you create through presence and connection and love, and he was finally learning how to do that. The cabin felt transformed by Christmas Eve. Silas had strung lights along the porch, a suggestion from Ruth, and brought in a small pine tree that he decorated with simple ornaments from the general store. It looked humble but welcoming, and when he stepped back to admire it, he felt a quiet pride in what he'd accomplished. Ruth had invited him to join her family for Christmas dinner, and he'd accepted, though he'd been nervous about it. Meeting her adult children and grandchildren felt like a big step, though he wasn't sure toward what exactly. He and Ruth had fallen into an easy friendship, nothing more. But there was a comfort between them that felt significant. On Christmas morning, he fed Maple extra sweet feed as a treat and spent an hour with her, brushing her coat until it shone. She leaned into his touch, patient and content, and he found himself grateful for this old donkey who'd been his witness through these months of change. At Ruth's house that afternoon, he was welcomed with genuine warmth. Her son Michael and daughter Amanda were in their 40s, both with families of their own, and they treated Silas like an old family friend rather than a stranger. The grandchildren, 3 of them ranging from 6 to 12, were curious about him, asking questions about living in the woods and whether he'd seen any bears. A few, Silas admitted. Mostly they mind their own business if you mind yours. Can we visit your cabin sometime? The youngest asked, a girl named Sophie with missing front teeth. Sophie, don't invite yourself places, Amanda chided gently. No, it's fine, Silas said. You're welcome to visit, all of you. Spring would be the best time. The wildflowers are beautiful in the meadow near the cabin. He caught Ruth's eye across the table and saw her pleased smile. This was what she'd been nudging him toward. He realized not just her friendship, but connection to a whole network of people, a ready-made community. After dinner, while the grandchildren played with their new toys, and the adults lingered over coffee, Michael asked Silas about his plans for the property. "Just fixing up the cabin for now," Silas said, "making it solid and comfortable. Beyond that, I'm not sure. I've thought about maybe keeping some chickens come spring, having a small garden. Nothing too ambitious at my age. You should consider hosting," Amanda suggested. "There are people who'd pay good money to rent a cabin in the woods for a week or weekend, especially one with history." "I hadn't thought about that," Silas admitted. "Just a thought," Amanda said. "You've done beautiful work from what Mom says. Seems a shame to keep it all to yourself." The idea stayed with him as he drove home that evening, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. The cabin, as a place that welcomed people rather than isolated them, it had appeal. Thomas had built it intending it to be a home for family, a gathering place. Maybe Silas could help it fulfill that purpose in a different way, but first there was still work to do. And there was still one piece of the puzzle missing. In late January, during a cold snap that kept him mostly inside, Silas decided it was time to do what he'd been avoiding, try to find out what had really happened to Thomas. The disappearance had haunted him since he first learned of it. Had Thomas died somewhere? Left to start over? The not knowing felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. He drove to the county courthouse in the larger town of Pinewood and spent hours in the records office, searching through old death certificates, missing persons reports, property records. The clerk, a patient young woman named Jessica, helped him navigate the system and even made some calls on his behalf. But there was nothing. No death certificate for Thomas Ray. No body ever found. The missing person report from 1964 had never been resolved, had simply gone cold. "What about his truck?" Silas asked. "If he drove away, there should be a record of the vehicle registration, maybe insurance records." Jessica searched, but found nothing conclusive. The truck had been a 1958 Ford F-100, registered to Thomas through 1963. After that, no renewals, no transfers, nothing. "It's like he just vanished," Jessica said, which I guess is what everyone thought at the time. Discouraged but not ready to give up, Silas tried one more avenue. He went to the local newspaper office, housed in a small building on Pinewood's main street, and asked to see their archives from 1964 and 1965. The editor, a man in his 50s named Robert, let him use their microfilm reader. "We weren't much of a paper back then," Robert warned. "Mostly local news, births, deaths, church notices. But you might find something." Silas scrolled through months of yellowed newspaper pages, his eyes straining at the small print. He found mentions of the weather, the snow that winter, local events. And then, in the March 15th, 1964 edition, a small article on page 3, "Local man missing, Thomas Ray, age 38 of Cedar Ridge, has been reported missing by concerned neighbors." Ray, who lived alone in a cabin on Forest Service Road 242, was last seen in early February. His truck, a blue 1958 Ford F-100, is also missing. Sheriff's deputies searched the cabin and surrounding area, but found no signs of foul play. Anyone with information is asked to contact the sheriff's office, that was all. Silas kept searching and found one more mention. A brief note in the April 2nd edition stating that the search for Thomas Ray had been suspended due to lack of leads. He sat back from the microfilm reader, frustrated. The trail was dead, had been dead for 60 years. Whatever had happened to Thomas, the answer wasn't in official records or newspaper archives. "Any luck?" Robert asked. "Not really," Silas admitted. "Just confirmed what I already knew. He disappeared, and nobody knows why." "That happens more than people think," Robert said, "especially back then, before computers and interstate databases. A man could start over if he wanted to, especially if he paid cash and didn't use his real name." "You think that's what happened?" Robert shrugged. "I think people are capable of surprising things when they're hurting badly enough. Maybe he wanted to disappear. Maybe he was tired of being Thomas Ray and all that name carried. It was a thought that hadn't quite crystallized for Silas before, but it rang true. Thomas had lost everything: his son, his wife, his brother, his dream of the cabin as a family home. Maybe disappearing had seemed like the only way to escape the weight of all that failure and grief. If that was the case, Silas thought, then maybe Thomas had gotten his wish for a fresh start. Maybe somewhere under a different name, he'd built a different life. It wasn't closure, but it was a possibility less bleak than dying alone in a ditch somewhere. He thanked Robert and drove home, mulling it over. That evening, he called Margaret again. "I've been trying to find out what happened to Thomas," he told her. "Searched county records, old newspapers. There's nothing. He's just gone." "Maybe that's okay," Margaret said softly. "Maybe not knowing is part of the story. He was a man who kept himself separate, who couldn't quite connect even when he wanted to. It's fitting in a sad way that he'd leave no clear trace." "You're more at peace with it than I am," Silas observed. "I've had longer to sit with it," Margaret said. "And I've learned through my work that sometimes we don't get the closure we want. Sometimes we have to make our own closure, write our own endings to other people's stories." "What ending would you write for Thomas?" Silas asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'd write that he found peace somewhere, that he started over, maybe met someone kind, maybe even had a chance to be happy. I'd write that he learned from his mistakes and did better the second time around. I don't know if that's true, but it's the ending I choose to believe." "That's generous of you," Silas said. "It's self-preservation," Margaret corrected gently. "If I believe my father died miserable and alone, it colors everything. But if I believe he might have found happiness, even briefly, then his story isn't just tragedy. It becomes something more complex, more human." After they hung up, Silas stood at the cabin window, looking out at the winter forest. The moon was nearly full, turning the snow blue-white, making the pine shadows sharp as knives. It was beautiful and cold and indifferent, the kind of landscape that could hide secrets for centuries. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe he needed to write his own ending to Thomas's story, one that he could live with. And maybe that ending was simply this: Thomas Ray had been a flawed man who'd tried his best and fallen short, but who'd left behind something valuable nonetheless. A cabin that was being restored, a family connection that was being rebuilt, lessons that were being learned and passed on. In the end, maybe that was enough of a legacy for anyone. February brought a stretch of clear, cold weather. Silas used the time to work on the exterior of the cabin, replacing a section of damaged logs on the north side and restaining the whole structure to protect it from the elements. The fresh stain gave the place a renewed look, like it had been brought back from the edge of ruin. He also started planning for spring. He'd build a proper corral for Maple with a small shelter she could use. He'd clear an area for a garden, nothing too ambitious, just tomatoes and lettuce and herbs, things that would be nice to have fresh. And he'd add a front porch swing, a place to sit on summer evenings and watch the light change on the mountains. But the biggest decision he made came after a long conversation with Ruth one evening at the diner. They'd stayed after closing, helping Helen clean up. And somehow the conversation had turned to loneliness and aging and what made life worth living. "I think it's being useful," Ruth had said, wiping down tables. "Being needed. That's why I keep working, even though I could retire. The store needs me, or at least I tell myself it does, and that gives me a reason to get up every morning." "I've felt that these past months," Silas said. "Working on the cabin, it's given me purpose. But I keep thinking about what comes after it's finished." "Then what?" "Then you find the next thing," Ruth said simply. "That's the trick. There's always a next thing if you're willing to look for it." The idea that had been germinating since Amanda's Christmas suggestion suddenly crystallized. "What if I opened the cabin to visitors?" Silas said. "Not like a commercial venture, nothing so formal, but maybe hosting people who need a quiet place to heal, or think, or just be away from the noise for a while." Ruth stopped wiping and looked at him. "That's a beautiful idea. And given the history of the place, it would be fitting. Thomas built it, hoping it would be a home for healing. You'd be fulfilling that purpose." "I'd need help," Silas said. I don't know anything about that kind of thing. Managing bookings, preparing for guests. I'd help, Ruth said immediately. And Amanda would too, I'm sure. She does marketing for her company. She'd know how to get the word out. They spent the next hour sketching out ideas. Keep it simple. 1 or 2 guests at a time, stays of a week or a few days. Provide the basics, but let people supply their own food. Market it not as a vacation rental, but as a retreat space, a place for quiet and reflection. Price it affordably, so it was accessible to people who really needed it, not just wealthy folks looking for an escape. The more they talked, the more excited Silas became. This felt right. This felt like the cabin was being given the purpose it had always meant to have. Over the next weeks, plans took shape. Amanda helped him create a simple website with photos of the cabin and the surrounding forest. Michael, who was handy with carpentry, offered to help build some additional amenities, a better porch, a storage shed. Ruth started spreading the word through her networks. And before Silas quite knew how it happened, he had his first booking. A woman from Seattle who'd recently lost her husband and wanted a place to be alone with her grief. Her name was Patricia, and she arrived in early April when the first signs of spring were breaking through the snow. She was in her late 60s, soft-spoken and carrying herself with the careful control of someone barely holding together. Silas showed her around the cabin, explained how everything worked, gave her the simple rules: respect the forest, leave no trace, call if she needed anything. Then he retreated to his truck, where he'd set up camp to give her full privacy. For 3 days, he barely saw her. She'd emerge occasionally to sit on the porch or walk the trails he'd marked around the property. But mostly she stayed inside, and Silas respected her solitude. On the 4th day, she knocked on his truck window. He was reading and looked up, surprised. "Would you like coffee?" Patricia asked. "I made too much." They sat on the porch, and Patricia talked. Not about her husband's death. She wasn't ready for that yet, she said. But about the cabin, about how the quiet was helping her breathe again. About how she'd been able to cry here, in a way she couldn't at home, surrounded by well-meaning friends. "Thank you for creating this space," she said. "I didn't know how much I needed it until I got here." After Patricia left, she sent a message through the website. "The cabin held my grief gently. I found pieces of myself I thought were lost. This place is healing." That message gave Silas more satisfaction than anything he'd accomplished in years. This was it, he realized. This was what the rest of his life could be about. Creating space for other people's healing, for their reflection, for their restoration. Just like he'd restored the cabin, he could help others restore themselves. As April turned to May, other guests came. A young man struggling with career burnout. A middle-aged couple trying to reconnect after years of drifting apart. A retired teacher writing a memoir. Each of them left transformed in some small way, and each of them left Silas feeling like his life had meaning beyond his own experience. Margaret called regularly, delighted with what he was doing. "You've turned tragedy into healing," she said. "Thomas would be proud, I think. His cabin has finally become what he dreamed it would be, a home for people who need it." Silas wasn't sure about that. Thomas had dreamed of a family home, of normalcy and permanence. This was something different. But maybe, he thought, it was something better, a place that helped many families, many individuals, rather than being tied to the success or failure of just one. In late May, Margaret called with news. She was finally coming to visit. She'd be driving out in June, bringing her younger son David with her. They'd stay for a long weekend, and she wanted to see everything, the cabin, the forest, the town of Cedar Ridge. Silas felt a flutter of nervousness and excitement. He prepared the cabin carefully, making sure everything was perfect. This visit mattered. Margaret was the living link to Thomas and Eleanor's story, and having her see what the cabin had become felt like completing a circle. He also invited Ruth to join them for dinner one evening, wanting Margaret to meet the woman who'd been so instrumental in his transformation. The day Margaret arrived, Silas stood in the clearing, watching her SUV navigate the rough road. When she stepped out, he saw the family resemblance immediately. She had Eleanor's eyes from the photographs, Thomas's height and bearing. They hugged, and Silas was surprised by how emotional he felt. "Welcome home," he said, though the cabin had never been her home. "Not really. It feels right being here," Margaret said, looking around at the clearing. At the restored cabin, with its fresh stain and welcoming porch. "I don't remember it clearly, but something in me recognizes it." Her son David, a quiet man in his 40s, helped unload their bags, while Margaret walked slowly around the property. Silas watched her process it all, saw the memories and emotions playing across her face. "Can I go inside?" she asked. "Of course. It's as much your place as mine, really." Margaret stepped through the door Silas had repaired and rehung. She stood in the main room, turning slowly, taking it all in. Silas had prepared everything, including displaying the cedar chest on the dining table, open to reveal the letters and photographs. Margaret walked to the chest like she was in a dream. She picked up one of the letters, her mother's handwriting bringing tears to her eyes. "These were my mother's," she whispered. "And these are yours," Silas said, bringing out the small wooden box he'd found under the floorboards. "I found these hidden away." "I think you left them here when you were 5. Margaret opened the box and pulled out the wooden horse. Her face crumpled, and she held it to her chest like a talisman. "I remember this," she said through tears. "I remember my father, Thomas, making this for me. He was sitting right there." She pointed to where Silas had placed an armchair, and he was carving it, and I was watching, and he looked so peaceful. It's the only memory I have of him looking happy. They spent the afternoon going through everything, the letters from Eleanor, the journal entries from Thomas, the unopened letters Eleanor had sent after the divorce. Margaret read them all, crying quietly while David sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "She forgave him," Margaret said, holding Eleanor's final letter. "She tried to tell him, and he never read it. God, what a waste! What a terrible waste! But not a meaningless one," Silas said gently. "We're here. We've learned from it. Their story is teaching us how to do better." That evening, Ruth came for dinner, and they all sat around the table, Silas, Margaret, David, and Ruth, eating and talking and sharing stories. Ruth told funny tales about the Cedar Ridge community. David talked about his work as a teacher. Margaret shared memories of Eleanor and her life after Thomas. "My mother had a good life," Margaret said. "William was a wonderful father to me. They were happy together. But I think she always carried Thomas with her, always wondered what he'd become, whether he ever found peace. Knowing now that he probably never read her letters of forgiveness, that breaks my heart for both of them. So let's honor them differently," Ruth suggested, "by making sure we don't repeat their mistakes, by saying what needs saying while there's still time." They raised their glasses, water for David, who didn't drink, wine for the others, and toasted to learning from the past, to second chances, to the healing power of honesty. Later, after Ruth had gone home, and David had gone to bed in the loft Silas had built, Margaret and Silas sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge as full dark settled. "Thank you for finding me," Margaret said, "for reaching out, for sharing all of this. I didn't know how much I needed to know my father's story until I heard it." "Thank you for being willing to hear it," Silas said, "and for forgiving him, even though he never asked for it." "I forgive them both," Margaret said. "My mother for taking me away, even though she had good reasons. My father for not being there, even though he was trying in his own broken way. And I forgive myself for the anger I carried toward them both for so many years." They sat in comfortable silence, the night sounds of the forest rising around them. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "What will you do with the cabin eventually? After—" she hesitated delicately. "After I die," Silas finished for her. "I've thought about that. I'd like it to go to you, if you want it. It's your family history as much as mine. But if you don't want it, I'd like it to become some kind of permanent retreat space, maybe managed by someone who'll keep its purpose intact." "I'd be honored to have it," Margaret said. "And I promise to keep it as a healing space. Maybe I'll even come stay here myself sometimes, in my retirement years. Bring my grandchildren, teach them about their great-grandmother Eleanor and their grandfather Thomas." "That would be good," Silas said. "Thomas and Eleanor's story deserves to be remembered, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." They sat until the cold drove them inside, and Silas felt more at peace than he could remember feeling. The past had been honored. The present was rich with meaning, and the future, however long or short it might be, held purpose and connection. The cabin that had been built on dreams and broken by tragedy had been restored, not just its walls and roof, but its heart. It had become, finally, what it was always meant to be, a home for healing. The morning Margaret and David prepared to leave, Silas stood with them by their packed SUV, reluctant to see them go. The 3 days of their visit had been rich with conversation and connection, and the cabin felt fuller somehow, blessed by their presence. "You'll come again?" Silas asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Absolutely," Margaret said, hugging him tightly. "This is family now. This place, you, all of it. And Silas, thank you. Thank you for giving my parents' story an ending that has meaning. You did that as much as I did," Silas said. "By being willing to forgive, to understand." David shook his hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, Uncle Silas," he said, and the casual use of the title made Silas's throat tight. He watched them drive away, their vehicle disappearing down the rutted road, dust rising in their wake. Then he turned and looked at the cabin, at Maple grazing contentedly in her new corral, at the forest rising green and alive around the clearing. This was home now. Not just a place, but a feeling, a purpose, a connection to past and future both. The next guest was arriving tomorrow, a woman who'd recently lost her adult daughter and needed space to grieve away from the expectations of others. Silas would welcome her, show her the cabin, then give her the solitude she needed. And in doing so, he'd honor Thomas and Eleanor's memory by creating the healing space they'd never been able to create for themselves. He spent the afternoon preparing, changing linens, stocking the small pantry with basics, making sure everything was welcoming. Ruth stopped by with fresh eggs from her own chickens and stayed for coffee on the porch. "You've done something remarkable here," she said, looking around at the restored cabin, at the peaceful clearing. "Turned something broken into something that heals. That's no small thing." "I had good help," Silas said, smiling at her. "Couldn't have done it without you. We make a good team," Ruth said, and there was something in her voice that made Silas look at her more carefully. She met his gaze steadily, a slight smile playing at her lips. "We do," he agreed, feeling something shift between them, some acknowledgement of what had been building for months. "I was thinking," Ruth said, "maybe this fall, after the busy season, we could take a trip together. Nothing fancy, just a few days somewhere. I've always wanted to see the Oregon coast." "I'd like that," Silas said. And he meant it. The idea of traveling with Ruth, of building new memories together, felt right. Not a betrayal of Emma's memory, he'd always loved Emma, but an affirmation that life continued. That connection and even love could be found again if you were open to it. They sat together as the afternoon stretched toward evening, talking about small things and big things, about the community and the cabin and their own lives. And Silas felt, for perhaps the first time since Emma died, that he was truly living rather than just existing. The months rolled on. Summer brought a steady stream of guests to the cabin, each one carrying their own grief or confusion or need for solitude. Silas became adept at reading what people needed. Some wanted conversation, others wanted to be left entirely alone. He learned when to offer a listening ear and when to simply maintain the space and let the forest do its healing work. Fall arrived with its explosion of gold and red, the aspen leaves turning the mountainside into a tapestry. Silas and Ruth took their trip to the coast, spending 4 days walking beaches and watching storms roll in from the Pacific. They held hands sometimes, comfortable with the slow pace of their growing relationship, neither rushing toward anything, but both acknowledging that something meaningful was developing. When they returned, there was a message waiting. A film producer had heard about the cabin through Margaret. She'd mentioned it to a colleague and wanted to know if they could use it as a location for a documentary about healing from loss. The money offered was generous, and Silas agreed, stipulating that the documentary should include Thomas and Eleanor's story as part of its narrative. The filming happened in October, and Silas found himself on camera, telling the story of his uncle and aunt, of loss and regret and missed chances at reconciliation. He talked about finding the letters, about meeting Margaret, about how restoring the cabin had restored something in himself. When the documentary aired the following spring, it brought more attention to the cabin than Silas had anticipated. Requests for stays multiplied, and he had to start a waiting list. But he kept his original vision intact. The cabin remained affordable, focused on people who genuinely needed a healing space, rather than those just seeking a trendy retreat. Margaret helped him hire a local college student to manage bookings and handle logistics, freeing Silas to focus on what he did best, maintaining the space and being present for those who needed a kind word or a sympathetic ear. His 75th birthday came and went, celebrated with a gathering at Ruth's house, the community turning out to honor the man who'd become one of them. There was a cake, embarrassing speeches, and genuine affection that made Silas tear up more than once. "You came here looking for a place to hide," Ruth said in her toast, "and instead you built something that helps others find themselves. That's the work of a life well lived." As winter approached again, Silas found himself taking stock. 2 years since he'd bought the cabin. 2 years of work and discovery and connection. The cabin was fully restored now, stable and warm and welcoming. His bank account was healthier than it had been in years, between the guest fees and wise investments Ruth had helped him make. He had community, had family in Margaret and her sons, had Ruth's companionship and the possibility of whatever came next between them. Most importantly, he had purpose. Each guest who came and left transformed. Each thank you note or email about how the cabin had helped. These were the measurements of his success now. Not acres owned or cattle raised, but lives touched and healing facilitated. One evening in December, sitting by the fire with a book in his lap, Silas realized he was happy. Not the wild happiness of youth or new love, but the deep, settled happiness of a man at peace with his life, his choices, his place in the world. Maple dozed in her shelter outside, content in her old age. The cabin held its warmth against the winter cold. And Silas Ray, 75 years old and still learning, still growing, felt grateful for every day he had. He thought of Emma sometimes, usually in the quiet moments like this. He'd talk to her silently, telling her about his days, about the people he was helping, about Ruth. He liked to think she approved, that wherever she was glad he'd found his way back to living, rather than just surviving. And he thought of Thomas and Eleanor, of the love they'd shared and lost, of the cabin that had been built with hope and broken by tragedy. Their story had found a kind of redemption through him, through the healing space he'd created. The cabin had been given a second chance, and so had he. That was the gift of it all, Silas thought. Second chances. The opportunity to learn from past mistakes, yours or others, and to do better. The cabin was proof that even broken things could be restored. That tragedy didn't have to be the end of the story. As long as someone was willing to do the work, to open their heart, to believe that healing was possible, then anything could be transformed. Even a ruined cabin full of junk. Even a lonely old cowboy who'd lost his way. Especially them. The fire crackled, and outside the first snow of December began to fall, covering the world in quiet white. Inside, Silas pulled a blanket over his lap and returned to his book, a small smile on his weathered face. He was home. On a clear morning in early June, nearly 3 years since Silas had first driven up that rough road to see the cabin, he stood in the clearing and surveyed his domain. The place had transformed beyond recognition. The cabin stood straight and proud, its logs gleaming with fresh treatment, its windows clear and bright, smoke rising from the chimney even on this warm day as he prepared breakfast. Maple was in her corral, older now and moving slower but still content. The garden he'd planted was thriving, neat rows of vegetables and herbs bordered by wildflowers that attracted bees and butterflies. A new storage shed stood beside the cabin, housing tools and supplies for guests. The paths he'd cleared through the forest were well marked and maintained, but the biggest change was harder to see. It was in him, in the lightness he carried now, in the purpose that got him out of bed each morning. Ruth's truck pulled into the clearing, and she got out carrying a basket. They'd fallen into a routine over these years, sharing meals several times a week, taking walks together, sitting on the porch in the evenings, and talking about everything and nothing. They hadn't defined what they were to each other beyond companions, but it was enough. More than enough. "Brought cinnamon rolls," she called. "Fresh this morning." "Coffee's ready," Silas replied. "And I have news." They settled on the porch with breakfast between them, and Silas told her about the call he'd received the day before. A major magazine wanted to do a feature story on the cabin, on its history and its current purpose. They wanted to interview him, Margaret, some of the guests who'd stayed here. "That's wonderful," Ruth said. "Though it'll probably mean even more people wanting to book stays." "I've been thinking about that," Silas said. "About expanding, maybe building another small cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, just something simple, so we could host more people without losing the intimate feel of the place." Ruth asked, her eyebrows raised with amusement. Silas felt his face warm. "Well, you've been so involved in all this, I just assumed. I mean, if you want to be—" "I'm teasing you," Ruth said gently, touching his hand. "Of course it's we. Has been for a while now, hasn't it?" "I suppose it has," Silas agreed, relieved. "I'm slow to catch on to these things. Emma used to say I was dense as a post when it came to emotional matters." "You're learning," Ruth said. "That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, eating cinnamon rolls and watching a hawk circle overhead. This was what happiness looked like at their age, Silas thought. Not fireworks and grand gestures, but quiet mornings and shared purpose, companionship and acceptance. "There's something else," Silas said. "I want to make it official. What happens to this place after I'm gone? I'm going to work with a lawyer to set up a trust. Make sure the cabin stays as a healing retreat space in perpetuity. Margaret will be the trustee, and I'd like you to be involved too, if you're willing." "I'm honored," Ruth said seriously, "and I think that's exactly the right thing to do. This place has become too important to too many people to let it fade away." Over the next months, Silas worked with a lawyer recommended by Margaret to establish the trust. It was complicated, involving property transfers and legal documentation, and long conversations about his wishes for the cabin's future. But by autumn it was done. The cabin would always be a healing space, always affordable, always available to those who needed it most. Margaret came to visit again, this time with her whole family, both sons, their wives, and 4 grandchildren ranging from 8 to 16. The cabin and the clearing came alive with their presence, with children's laughter and the chaos of a large family meal cooked on the grill Silas had installed. One evening, after dinner, Margaret asked Silas to take a walk with her. They followed one of the forest paths, moving slowly in deference to their aging joints, until they reached a small meadow where wildflowers grew thick and deer often grazed at dawn. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said. "Something I've never told anyone else." Silas waited, giving her time. "When my mother was dying," Margaret continued, "in those last few weeks when she was in and out of consciousness, she talked about Thomas, about my father. She was confused sometimes, thought he was there in the room. And she'd talk to him, tell him things. What did she say?" Silas asked gently. "She told him she was sorry. Sorry for leaving, sorry for not trying harder. Sorry for not understanding how much his grief over Samuel was destroying him. She said," Margaret's voice caught, "she said, I should have stayed. I should have helped you carry it instead of running away." Over and over she said that. "She was carrying her own guilt," Silas observed. "She was," Margaret agreed. "I think they both carried so much guilt, so much regret, and neither of them ever found a way to let it go, to forgive themselves or each other." She turned to face Silas. "But you've changed that story's ending. By creating this healing space, by honoring their memory while refusing to repeat their mistakes, you've redeemed their tragedy, given it meaning and purpose." "We've done it together," Silas corrected. "You, me, Ruth, this whole community." Thomas and Eleanor's story has become bigger than just their personal tragedy. It's become a teaching story, one that helps others avoid the same pitfalls. They walked back to the cabin as twilight settled, and Silas felt the weight of Margaret's words. He was 76 now, aware of his mortality in ways he hadn't been even a few years ago. But he wasn't afraid of death anymore. He'd made peace with Emma's loss, had found new purpose and connection, had created something that would outlast him. That was what Thomas had failed to do, to find meaning after loss, to build something new from the ruins of what was broken. But Silas had learned from that failure, had chosen a different path. As fall deepened toward winter, Silas found himself thinking about legacy. Not about monuments or fame, but about the small ways a life rippled outward, touching others. Every guest who left the cabin changed. Every conversation that opened someone's heart. Every moment of healing that took place here. These were his legacy. More valuable than any material wealth or physical structure. Ruth moved in that November. Not making a big production of it, but simply staying more nights than she went home, bringing her things over gradually until it became clear she lived there now. They were both too old to worry about what people thought, and the community responded with warm acceptance. "About time," Helen from the diner said. "You two have been circling each other like shy teenagers for 2 years." Silas had laughed, but she wasn't wrong. They'd both been cautious, protective of their independence and their previous marriages' memories. But they'd learned that loving someone new didn't diminish what came before. Ruth wasn't Emma, and Silas wasn't Ruth's late husband John. They were themselves, two older people who'd found companionship and affection in their later years. And that was its own kind of blessing. Christmas came, and they hosted Margaret's family again, the cabin bursting with life and noise and joy. Silas looked around at the faces, at Margaret, who'd become like a daughter to him, at her sons and grandchildren, who called him Uncle Silas, at Ruth, who caught his eye and smiled, at the friends from town who'd stopped by with cookies and gifts and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what life was supposed to be about. Not perfection, not avoiding loss or pain, but building connections, finding meaning, creating spaces where healing could happen. Thomas and Eleanor never got to experience this, never found their way to this kind of peace and community. Their story ended in separation and sorrow. But through Silas, through the cabin he'd restored and the purpose he'd given it, their story had been given a new chapter, one filled with hope and healing. And that, Silas thought, as he looked around at the people filling the cabin with warmth and laughter, was the best kind of redemption any story could have. New Year's Day found Silas alone in the cabin. Ruth had gone to spend time with her children, and he used the quiet to reflect. He pulled out Thomas's journal, which he still kept on the bookshelf, and read through it one more time. The entries still carried their weight of sadness, but now they also felt instructive. Cautionary tales about the cost of isolation and unspoken feelings. He thought about writing his own journal entry, a response of sorts to Thomas's final words. He found a notebook and began to write. "Thomas, I never knew you, but your story changed my life. You built this cabin with hope and lost everything here. I found it in ruins and learned from your mistakes. I want you to know that the dream you had of this place being a home, a haven, it came true, just not the way you imagined. Dozens of people have stayed here now, each one carrying their own grief or pain. They come broken and leave a little more whole. The cabin holds their stories the way it once held yours. And in doing so, it's become what you always wanted, a place of healing and renewal. I hope wherever you ended up that you found peace. I hope you were able to forgive yourself for the things you couldn't control, for the losses you couldn't prevent. I hope you learned to live again, even if we never knew about it. But if you didn't, if you died still carrying all that regret and pain, then let this cabin be your peace now. Let the healing that happens here be your redemption. Every person who finds solace in these walls, that's your gift to them. Your suffering wasn't meaningless. It taught me, and through me it's teaching others. Thank you for leaving your story behind. Thank you for this place. And thank you for showing me, through all your mistakes, how to do better with my own remaining time. Your nephew, Silas." He closed the notebook and sat for a long time, watching the winter sun track across the cabin floor. Outside, a deer moved through the clearing, pausing to look at the cabin before bounding away into the trees. Maple drowsed in her shelter, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Silas felt at peace, not because his life was perfect or his future certain, but because he'd found his purpose, had made his mistakes count for something, had honored the past while building something new. The cabin stood solid around him, warm and welcoming, ready for the next guest who would arrive tomorrow. A man recovering from a stroke who needed quiet space to regain his strength and spirit. Silas would welcome him, show him the space, then step back and let the cabin do what it did best, hold people gently while they healed. This was the work now. This was the legacy, not grand or famous, but meaningful in ways that mattered. One person at a time, one story at a time. The cabin was fulfilling its purpose, and Silas Ray, 76 years old, and finally at home, was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The lonely cowboy had bought a ruined cabin full of junk. What he found inside had indeed changed everything, not through treasure or revelation, but through the simple, profound lesson that broken things could be restored, that lost dreams could be reimagined, and that it was never too late to choose connection over isolation, purpose over drift, healing over despair. The cabin had taught him that. Thomas and Eleanor's tragedy had taught him that. And now, every day, he got to pass those lessons on to others who needed them. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything.